Intellectual History of Conservatism with my first article was a critique of George Nash, who we heard about in last morning's session. And so I've sort of always thought of myself as someone who's working against an older tradition and trying to start something different. And with my book on Ayn Rand, I think the subtitle tells a lot of the story. I chose it very deliberately, Ayn Rand and the American Right, because I have some trouble, as is maybe natural for intellectual historians, with the very language and terminology we use. So the choice of the subtitle, The American Right, was meant to sort of question implicitly this idea of American conservatism and ask if we should be looking at a different type of category or a different type of terminology besides conservatism. Now, this came to light with Ayn Rand very specifically because she's not a conservative. She's very different from conservatives in many ways, primarily in her forthright hatred of all things religious and traditional. Yet it's hard to say that you can talk about the history of conservative thought in America without including her in that somehow. So for me, that laid out a set of questions. I'm not going to claim her for conservatism, but undoubtedly, if I do my history right, I have to admit she's in there, she's an element, she's someone at play. So I chose this term, the American Right, to try to draw attention to outliers like Rand, secular thinkers, more economic thinkers, who might not fall into this definition of conservatism that we've been working with, but are nonetheless important parts of the story. So that's one of the things I tried to do with Rand. What I want to do today is continue that project a little bit of destabilizing or questioning this term of American conservatism or the definitions we use. And this really goes back to the root of my critique of Nash, I think, which recognized that the reason he's been so durable is he's given us a really clear way to define and to understand conservatism. He essentially proposed a three-part definition of conservatism. He presented it as a fusionist ideology that consisted of religious traditionalism, economic libertarianism, and anti-communism. Now, anti-communism is slightly different from the others in that it's less articulated as a formal system of thought, but he really said American conservatism is a fusion or a balance of these three. So I think that's something that we've all been working with as a definition. We've taken it implicitly as the way to think about it. It's really hard to sort of get outside the box. So one of the points I'm going to offer here is that I think looking forward to the next generation of scholarship, I hope we can start to think more creatively about the definition of American conservatism and try to get out of not just this definition, but get out of the idea of the movement. And I think the movement is a critical thing we need to think about and we need to question. So that's going to be the first thing I bring forward. How can we think about or work with conservatism as an intellectual tradition without the movement as our crutch? Is that possible? And what would be the benefits of doing that? The second point I want to make is that I think we should all work harder to situate American conservatism in an international intellectual context. And I mean that in several different ways. One is looking at the sort of vectors of influence from Europe and other places that have influenced American conservatism, looking at how American conservatism has gone the other way, and then also looking at how Americans and conservatives, more so than many others, have defined themselves against other countries, specifically against Europe, but against a host of other countries. So we as historians may not buy American exceptionalism, but a lot of Americans do. So I think sort of looking at how other countries and other traditions to form our own sense of self is important. So let me start with this first idea of conservatism as a movement. First of all, what do we mean by movement conservatism? We say it all the time. I think the first thing we mean is this fusionist idea, articulated most prominently by Frank Meyer, National Review editor, who sort of brokered a compromise between warring factions in the 50s. This compromise was then enforced by William F. Buckley at National Review. So it seems that movement conservatism refers to this fusion. And it seems like movement conservatism has a lot to do with balance. In other words, proper movement conservatism achieves some type of stasis or balance between these three parts. And if you emphasize one of these more than the other, you are cast out of the fold of movement conservatism. So this happens with Ayn Rand. She's too economically oriented. She doesn't give religion due respect. She's out. It happens with the Birchers. They take the anti-communist thing a little too far. They don't balance it properly. They're out. I have to say, I was highly stimulated, amused, and entertained by Leo Rebuffalo's works, but I think we could use a good book on the John Birch Society. I'm not aware that there's a monograph out there that examines it. If I'm wrong, someone please tell me so. I'd love to read it. And I've sicked many undergrads on, the fluoridation campaign, the impeach Earl Warren. There's all this great, colorful stuff, and it would be wonderful to have a book on that. And then I actually think, that book could really engage a lot of the literature on social movements that other fields are giving us that we maybe could use more effectively. And on the question of balance, I think we can see this even happening today. Recently, Glenn Beck sort of crossed a line when he said, if your church is interested in social justice, leave your church. And this is obviously problematic for many people. So I think this idea of balancing and being part of this sort of tripart alliance has some reality to it and some validity. But I think one of the problems with this focus on balance or this focus on fusionism is we lose sight of the people who don't do that, the people on the margins. And as I try to show with my book on Rand, she's very extreme, but that makes her almost a concentrate of a set of ideas. She's like a tincture, and that's very, very powerful. And people may not stay in the allegiance to these intense ideas, but as our allegiance to Greenspan may help us see, an encounter with them can be very formative and very strong. So to push out these more extreme or less balanced elements, I think blinds us to some really important things that are happening. So what do we mean by movement? Maybe we mean balance. I also think we mean the Republican Party. Are you electorally aligned to the Republican Party? Do you support Republican Party candidates? Support of the GOP seems essential to defining you as a part of movement conservatism or not. It's the ultimate litmus test. Are you on the bus? Or are you off the bus? Do you vote Republican or not? And again, I think when we focus on movement conservatism oriented towards republicanism, we miss a whole other set of conservative ideas that may not have anything to do with Republican electoral politics. Again, it blinds us to other figures who may be relevant. We have a steady stream of books about Reagan as this sort of embodiment of conservative movement or conservative politics. Well, what about Clinton? You could argue that Clinton actually codified and legitimized a whole host of conservative ideas. But if we focus on a movement, if we focus on the Republican Party, we're not going to put him into that story.